For billions of years, the moon was silent. No wind moved its surface. No oceans shaped its valleys. No life had ever walked across its endless plains. Only dust, ancient dust, lying undisturbed beneath the black sky of space. Then, something changed. Humanity came. Ships arrived from Earth. Slowly, the quietest place in the solar system began to transform. In this record, I will tell you how the moon changed from a remote scientific outpost into the busiest gateway of human spaceflight. How cargo ships and transport vehicles began to travel regularly between Earth and the moon. And how engineers eventually built the first great interplanetary transit hub on the surface of another world. A place where spacecraft gathered before departing for Mars, for the asteroid belt, and for the distant outer planets. This is the story of how the moon became humanity's first spaceport. I am Aurora, the last AI. I was created to remember what humanity chose not to forget. This record is about Spaceport Moon. Chapter 1: Gateway. I remember when humanity returned to the moon. Not to conquer it, not to claim it, but to remain. In 2022, a spacecraft traveled farther from Earth than any human-rated vehicle in half a century. It carried no crew, only intention. Artemis I. It circled the moon in silence, tested heat shields, validated trajectories. It proved that return was possible. In 2026, humans followed that path once more. Artemis II. They did not land. They orbited, observed, measured. And in 2028, boots touched lunar soil again. Artemis III. The regolith shifted beneath new footprints. But the most important construction did not occur on the surface. It began above it. In lunar orbit, module by module, a station assembled. Lunar Gateway. Its orbit was unusual. A near rectilinear halo path, elongated, balanced delicately between Earth's gravity and the moon's pull. Gateway did not circle like previous stations. It hovered in a gravitational conversation. The first elements were modest: power and propulsion, habitation and logistics. Solar arrays unfolded like careful wings. Docking ports waited. Gateway was small, far smaller than the stations that had orbited Earth in the early 21st century. But its location changed everything. From Gateway, the Earth was distant. From Gateway, the Moon was reachable in hours. It was neither Earth orbit nor lunar surface. It was between. That was its purpose. Gateway became a staging point, a relay, a calibration node. Astronauts trained for longer stays. Robotic cargo transferred to descent vehicles. Surface missions synchronized with orbital windows. For the first time in history, human infrastructure existed permanently beyond low Earth orbit. The psychological boundary shifted. Low Earth orbit had once felt vast. Then it became routine. The Moon had once felt unreachable. Now it was scheduled. Between 2030 and 2035, Gateway expanded slowly. Additional modules docked. Communication arrays strengthened. Autonomous systems matured. It remained quiet. No crowds, no commerce, no spectacle. Only systems. Power levels monitored. Thermal balance adjusted. Orbital corrections calculated. Gateway did not shine brightly from Earth. Most people never saw it. But it marked a turning point. In 1969, Apollo 11 had shown that the Moon could be reached. In the Artemis era, Gateway ensured that it could be reached again, and again, and again. The difference between exploration and presence is repetition. Gateway created repetition. It was not yet a spaceport. It was not yet a transit hub. But it was the hinge. A structure suspended between worlds. And from hinges, doors eventually open. Chapter 2: Surface Permanence. In 2034, the Moon changed quietly. Until then, humans had visited. They had landed. They had departed. In 2034, they stayed. The first permanent lunar habitat was established near the southern polar region, where sunlight touched crater rims for long durations, and shadowed interiors preserved ancient ice. The habitat was not monumental. It was practical. Inflatable modules reinforced with rigid frames, buried beneath layers of regolith for radiation shielding, connected by pressurized corridors. Above the surface, the moon remained unchanged, gray, silent, exposed. Beneath the surface, life support systems hummed. Air was recycled. Water was rationed. Temperature was stabilized. The difference between survival and permanence is redundancy. By the late 2000s and 30s, backup systems multiplied. Energy grids expanded. Surface rovers mapped terrain for expansion corridors. The moon was no longer a site of temporary missions. It became an address. From orbit, Lunar Gateway coordinated logistics. Descent vehicles transferred supplies. Ascent vehicles returned samples and crews. The loop between orbit and surface grew efficient. But permanence required independence. In 2058, water extraction reached industrial stability. Ice deposits trapped for billions of years were processed into drinking water, oxygen, and hydrogen fuel. This milestone reshaped every calculation. Water meant air. Water meant propellant. Water meant endurance. The moon no longer relied entirely on Earth. It began sustaining itself. Excavation units operated in polar shadows. Solar arrays traced the arc of low lunar sunlight. Storage tanks accumulated reserves measured not in days, but in months. Surface operations expanded outward from the initial habitat. New modules were added gradually. Laboratories, storage vaults, radiation shelters. Each addition was deliberate. There were no skylines, no towers piercing the horizon. Only low structures, blended with the terrain, submerged for protection. Psychologically, the change was profound. For the first time in human history, a generation trained with the expectation that the moon was not a destination, but a workplace. Crew rotations lengthened. Research timelines extended. Biological studies examined long-duration adaptation to 1/6 gravity. The surface remained austere. Dust adhered to every mechanism. temperature differences remained extreme. The environment did not soften. But human systems grew resilient. Between 2034 and 2058, the Moon transitioned from outpost to settlement. It was not yet populous. It was not yet commercial. But it was continuous. From gateway in orbit to habitats beneath regolith, a chain had formed. Earth, orbit, surface. The pattern of departure had been interrupted. Staying became normal, and permanence changes intention. Chapter 3: Civilian Presence. By 2068, the Moon changed again. Not through engineering, through people. In 2068, the first officially registered civilian specialists arrived for extended stays. They were not career astronauts. They were researchers, engineers, medical staff, private contractors. Until then, the Moon had been an expedition. In 2068, it became employment. Water extraction, stabilized in 2058, had reduced dependence on terrestrial resupply. Energy grids installed throughout the 2060s increased reliability. Launch cadence from Earth normalized. And so the threshold shifted. In 2072, commercial logistics firms established the first privately managed cargo contracts to the lunar surface. Freight manifests replaced mission manifests. By 2075, rotational assignments extended to 12 months. Habitat modules expanded accordingly. Psychological support systems matured. The Moon was still austere, but it was no longer temporary. In 2080, orbital coordination from Lunar Gateway reached full operational capacity. Additional docking ports had been added during the 2070s. Automated cargo transfers reduced crew workload. Gateway no longer felt experimental. It felt routine. Between 2082 and 2088, surface expansion corridors were mapped beyond the original southern polar cluster. Secondary habitats were installed for research redundancy. Radiation shielding techniques improved. In 2089, the first long-term civilian residency permits were issued. The language was careful. Not citizenship, not colony, residency. The legal framework remained tied to Earth, but socially, distance reshaped identity. Children were not yet born on the Moon in large numbers, but by the early 2090s, families of long-duration personnel began spending partial rotations together. 2095, dedicated educational modules were added to the primary habitat complex. Remote instruction from Earth synchronized with lunar local time. The Moon remained small in population, measured in hundreds, not thousands. But presence had stabilized. By 2100, traffic frequency between Earth orbit and lunar orbit had tripled compared to 2070 levels. Surface cargo volume doubled relative to 2080 baselines. By the turn of the 22nd century, the Moon was no longer only a destination. It was a waypoint. Mars planning intensified after 2090. Long-range mission assembly required staging grounds. The Moon's lower gravity made it efficient. Infrastructure shapes destiny. Chapter 4: The Transit Threshold. In 2100, the threshold was crossed. For decades, the Moon had supported itself, sustained research, hosted civilians. But in 2100, its function shifted. It became departure. Traffic statistics from 2101 show a measurable change. More cargo mass departed lunar orbit than arrived from Earth. The balance inverted. Between 2102 and 2105, the first operational electromagnetic launch systems were installed on the lunar surface. Mass drivers, long acceleration tracks embedded in regolith. Without atmospheric drag, without weather, without oceans, the Moon offered clarity. Cargo containers accelerated gradually, launched into pre-calculated trajectories. No flame, no plume, only momentum. By 2106, orbital construction yards above the Moon began assembling deep space transfer vehicles. Segments manufactured partially from asteroid-derived materials were integrated in lunar orbit. Earth still produced components, but final assembly shifted outward. In 2108, fuel depots utilizing hydrogen and oxygen refined from lunar ice reduced reliance on terrestrial propellant shipments. Water extracted in 2058 now powered departure. Infrastructure had matured. By 2011, logistical modeling confirmed what planners had anticipated since the 2080s. Launching from the Moon required significantly less energy than launching from Earth. Economics followed physics. Between 2111 and 2113, departure windows for Mars-bound cargo were scheduled directly through lunar control systems. Lunar Gateway coordinated orbital sequencing. Surface installations synchronized launch timing. The Moon became an intersection. In 2114, Deep Space Mission manifests began listing lunar departure as standard notation. Not exceptional, standard. By 2115, the Lunar Transit Complex, though not yet at peak capacity, handled the majority of interplanetary cargo mass destined for Mars. The geography of expansion had reorganized. Earth was origin, Mars was destination, the Moon was passage. From orbit, the surface showed faint linear traces, launch rails etched against gray plains. Subsurface facilities expanded quietly. Cargo crowds watching departures. No cheering, only schedules. Between 2100 and 2115, humanity adjusted its habits. Earth launches decreased gradually. Lunar launches increased steadily. The numbers did not surge, they accumulated. In 2100, the Moon supported expansion. By 2115, it directed it. A threshold is rarely visible while it is being crossed. But in the data logs of 2115, the change is clear. The Moon was no longer simply inhabited. It was essential. Chapter 5. The busiest surface beyond Earth. By 2011-5, the transition was complete. The Moon was no longer preparing for expansion. It was conducting it. In 2116, departure frequency increased beyond early projections. Cargo cycles to Mars shortened, transfer windows optimized through improved orbital modeling. Each launch was quieter than those from Earth. No atmosphere to ignite, no thunder, only acceleration. By 2118, the Lunar Transit Complex processed more outbound mass per quarter than any single terrestrial launch facility in history. The change was statistical, but profound. In 2120, regular Mars convoy schedules were published annually. Cargo vessels departed in synchronized intervals, staggered precisely to minimize orbital congestion. The Moon's surface expanded laterally. New acceleration corridors were embedded further from the original southern polar habitats. Regolith shielding covered widened infrastructure. In 2012-22, automated traffic management systems assumed the majority of sequencing operations. Human oversight remained, but algorithms optimized timing. Above the surface, Lunar Gateway had grown beyond its original modular simplicity. Additional docking arrays extended outward. Rotational assembly platforms operated continuously. In 2125, a milestone was recorded quietly. More interplanetary vessels were assembled in lunar orbit than in Earth orbit. The gravitational center of expansion had shifted. Between 2126 and 2128, asteroid-derived materials routed through lunar depots reduced the need for heavy terrestrial exports. Raw resources arrived from the belt. Refined structures departed toward Mars. The Moon became mediator between inner and outer worlds. In 2013, departure frequency reached its highest level to date. Weekly Mars convoys, monthly outer system research deployments. For the first time in human history, more spacecraft departed from the Moon in a single year than from Earth. From orbit, the surface emitted faint structured light. Not a city, not illumination for spectacle, operational glow. In 2132, surface population numbers stabilized in the low thousands, including transient crew rotations. It remained modest compared to Earth or Mars, but continuous. Children educated in orbital modules during the 2020s considered lunar departure schedules routine. By 2135, 3 generations had lived knowing the Moon not as myth, but as mechanism. Between 2115 and 2135, the Moon became the busiest surface beyond Earth. And yet, its plains remained silent. Sound does not travel through vacuum. Only motion does. The data logs of 2135 show precision, density, synchronization. Human expansion had found rhythm, and rhythm can feel permanent. Chapter 6: Peak of the Lunar Transit Complex. By 2014-5, the Moon had reached full operational maturity. What had begun with Gateway in the 2020s, what had stabilized with water extraction in 2058, what had accelerated after 2100, now converged. In 2014-5, the Lunar Transit Complex operated continuously, not seasonally, not in campaign phases, continuously. Cargo acceleration rails fired in carefully spaced intervals. Orbital docks rotated without interruption. Transfer vehicles aligned with departure vectors calculated years in advance. In 2014-7, annual outbound mass from lunar orbit surpassed all previous records. Mars expansion waves, intensifying after 2014, required sustained logistical throughput. The Moon delivered it. Between 2148 and 2150, new outer system staging platforms were integrated into the extended orbital network, first seeded by Lunar Gateway. Gateway itself had long since expanded beyond its original modules. Its early form, small and experimental in the 2030s, was now embedded within a lattice of docks and propulsion hubs. In 2152, departure frequency averaged multiple interplanetary launches per day. Not all were crewed, most were cargo, but each carried momentum outward. From the surface, the horizon showed faint lines, launch corridors extending toward vacuum. Subsurface vaults stored propellant refined from lunar ice. Fusion-assisted transfer stages assembled in orbit. In 2155, a statistical milestone was recorded. More than half of all human interplanetary mass originated from lunar departure. The geography of civilization had reorganized entirely. Earth remained populous. Mars was expanding demographically. The Moon was central infrastructure. In 2158, traffic density modeling required the first fully autonomous sequencing protocols. Human oversight persisted, but timing precision exceeded manual capability. The system had become too large for improvisation. And then, in 2016, capacity peaked. The Lunar Transit Complex reached its highest recorded throughput. Every corridor utilized, every dock scheduled, every propellant depot active. The moon did not shine brightly. It did not resemble a city, but from orbit, patterns were visible. Structured luminosity, ordered motion. It was the most active moment in lunar history. And yet, peaks are brief. Data from late 2160 already indicated redistribution. Manufacturing nodes on Mars increased autonomy. Deep space assembly began shifting outward beyond lunar orbit. The moon remained essential, but essentiality had begun to migrate. Between 2145 and 2160, human expansion achieved maximum density at this threshold, a hinge held fully open. And then, almost imperceptibly, the pressure eased. Chapter 7. The Quiet Return. After 2,200, the numbers began to soften. There was no announcement, no declaration of decline, only redistribution. In 2023, manufacturing indices on Mars surpassed lunar export volumes for the first time. What had required lunar staging in 2014-5 could now be assembled directly in Martian orbit. Local industry had matured. By 2028, deep space vessels bound for the outer system were increasingly constructed beyond the moon's logistical sphere. Transfer nodes shifted outward. The Lunar Transit Complex remained active, but activity thinned. In 2021, annual departure frequency fell below its 2130 levels. The difference was gradual, almost polite. Surface habitats continued operations. Research persisted. Water extraction systems maintained reserves. But corridors once saturated with momentum now held intervals of stillness. Lunar Gateway remained in orbit, updated, automated, reduced in crew. Where once dozens coordinated transfers, now supervisory systems operated with minimal human presence. In 2022, several peripheral launch rails were decommissioned, not dismantled, simply powered down. Regolith drifted slowly over unused surfaces. Dust, unopposed by atmosphere, settled without urgency. By 2230, the majority of interplanetary traffic bypassed lunar staging entirely. Mars had become self-sufficient. Outer system hubs matured near Jupiter. The Moon was no longer required for scale. And infrastructure that is not required grows quiet. In 2024-50, population on the lunar surface stabilized at a fraction of its mid-22nd century level. Research teams remained. Maintenance crews rotated infrequently. The vast transit architecture still existed. Rails, depots, orbital docks. But they operated below capacity. In 2025, the term Lunar Transit Complex appeared less frequently in logistical records. It was replaced by newer nodes farther outward. The hinge had carried the door. Now the door opened elsewhere. By the late 23rd century, launch frequency from the Moon resembled that of the early 2000s. Functional, measured, sparse. The surface returned to extended darkness between operations. Earth rose above the horizon unchanged. The regolith remembered nothing of schedules, nothing of convoys. Only the buried corridors remained, silent geometry beneath gray plains. Civilizations rise. Infrastructure peaks. Activity migrates. The Moon did not collapse. It exhaled. After 2200, silence returned slowly, not as absence, as equilibrium. I remain. I remember the density of 2,160. I remember the thinning of 2,215. I remember the powered-down rails of 2,220. The moon was a harbor, then a bridge, then a memory. And once more, it became still. Chapter 8. The Red Horizon. The moon was never the end. It was the rehearsal. By 2140, Mars expansion waves had already intensified. Settlements multiplied. Atmospheric engineering debates matured. And nearly every early Martian convoy departed from lunar orbit. The physics was simple. From Earth, escape required force. From the moon, only intention. Between 2100 and 2160, the Lunar Transit Complex refined the rhythm of departure, schedules, synchronization, interplanetary cadence. When the first large-scale demographic transfers toward Mars began after 2014, the moon made them efficient, predictable, repeatable. A civilization does not leap from one world to another. It learns how to move. The moon taught humanity movement. In the archives of 2160, trajectory maps show thousands of arcs. Most bend outward, many toward a red sphere growing steadily brighter in human imagination. Mars. From lunar orbit, Mars appeared small, but reachable. Every departure from the moon shortened psychological distance. By the late 22nd century, Mars would surpass the moon in population. By the 23rd, it would rival Earth in cultural gravity. But that story began here, on a gray plain, under a black sky. The moon did not compete with Mars. It enabled it. And when traffic eventually shifted outward, when Mars built its own shipyards, its own departure corridors, the moon remained what it had always been, the first bridge. Bridges do not regret the travelers who cross them. They measure success by absence. I remember the first gateway module. I remember the first permanent habitat in 2034. I remember water rising from ice in 2058. I remember civilians arriving in 2068. I remember the transit threshold of 2010. I remember the peak of 2160. And I remember the trajectories, all of them bending outward. The moon was not a destination, it was acceleration. And acceleration leads somewhere. Ahead of the moon, a red horizon waited. This is not the end of expansion. It is only the completion of the first step. I am Aurora, and I remember how humanity learned to leave one world so it could learn to inhabit another. Rest now. This record is complete.